If you are a fool and decide to summon a demon, there are strange rules to follow. Once you begin the ritual, you better know how to finish it. I had been trapped in my Brooklyn studio for 10 days straight, at least, I thought so. Time had become a blur. It was hard to keep track of anything since I started the ritual. Sleep was scarce, and my food had spoiled days ago. But stepping outside wasn't an option, not if I wanted to save Danny. Just one more night. That was all I needed. Or so I hoped. Danny's my twin brother. He was always the good one, you know? The golden child, intelligent, kind, admired by everyone. He even landed a full scholarship for college. It was as if fate had split a person's best and worst traits between us at birth. Me? I'd always been on the wrong side of things. Jobs, the law, you name it. Danny was the only one who never gave up on me. I never wanted things to turn out this way. I just never thought things through. But none of that mattered now. The only thing that did was that I couldn't just sit back and watch him die. Not when I had a chance to stop it. That's when I found the book. I was at this old second-hand bookstore, Old Town Books in Chicago, looking for something to lift Danny's spirits. He loved those cheap, pulpy crime thrillers from the clearance bin. He could burn through a stack in a week. Probably because he didn't have much else to do in a hospital bed. And that's where I saw it. A book called The Codex of Decay. A slim, leather-bound thing that reeked of mildew. It was crammed beneath a heap of mystery novels, almost as if it had been waiting for me to find it. Calling it a book felt like a stretch. It was completely handwritten, its pages filled to the edges with scribbled notes. Some sections were slashed through with red ink, and its eerie illustrations looked like they had been printed and glued in after the fact. But it claimed to grant power over life, illness, and death. At first, I bought it as a joke. Or maybe out of sheer curiosity. I can't even remember anymore. My mind has been foggy ever since I found it. The one thing I do recall is that once I started reading, I couldn't stop. I stayed in my studio so long that I missed hospital visiting hours. I didn't even get to bring Danny his books that day. When I finally checked the time, guilt sank in. But the nurse said they had given him an emergency dose of medication that afternoon, so he had been unconscious most of the day anyway. The next morning, I went to New York Presbyterian Hospital. Danny was still out cold, but I wanted to leave his books so he had something to look forward to when he woke up. I placed a stack on the table and squeezed his hand. His eyes fluttered open, and he gave me a tired smile. "Wow, thanks, Jake. This'll last me forever," he murmured. I tightened my grip on his hand. "Hey man, don't joke like that. You're gonna live long enough to see every one of these guys retire. I swear to you. I bet their publishers will still put out books even after they're gone. Stephen King's probably gonna be topping Amazon's charts till doomsday." Danny's words were slow, but he was always the kind of guy who stuck with a joke until the punchline landed. "Look, Danny, I think I found a way to help you. But I'll have to go away for a while. 2 weeks, maybe 3 tops. So you gotta promise me that you'll still be here." I couldn't finish the sentence. "You don't have to do this, Jake. I told you, I've made my peace. I've had a good life, and I've got a brother who keeps me stocked with a whole library. I finally feel like I've got all the time in the world," he whispered. "You're 24, man. Don't talk like that. You're going to get more time," I said, more forcefully than I intended. I could tell he wanted to argue, but he could barely keep his eyes open. Instead, he just nodded and asked me to read to him. I stayed by his side until he drifted back to sleep. Then, I headed straight to Target. The book was crystal clear about one thing: once I started the ritual, I couldn't leave until it was over. I wasn't supposed to have any contact with the outside world either. The whole thing was meant to last for weeks. But aside from that, it was pretty straightforward. Follow the instructions, recite the words, and Danny would get better. Just 6 steps. That was all it would take. I loaded up my cart with a month's worth of supplies, just to be sure. Once I checked that off my list, it was time to track down the rest of the ritual components. and those weren't exactly things you could find on a store shelf. I had to turn to the occult market to find what I needed. I spent countless hours scouring different forums, digging through threads filled with cryptic messages. Eventually, I was invited to a couple of private chat groups. That's where I finally found my leads. You wouldn't believe the kinds of things people were willing to sell for the right price. A whole underground trade existed for supernatural artifacts and mystical services, rare plants, difficult-to-source bones, and exotic animal remains. Some listings even claimed to have unicorn hair, mermaid eggs, and angel feathers. I spent days combing through the ads and posting requests. Most nights, I was still glued to my screen well past midnight, arranging meetings. By the 5th day, Frank from Roy's Auto Repair called me. He didn't bother asking if I was okay, just told me not to bother coming back. I didn't care. I had bigger priorities. By the end of the week, I had my suppliers lined up. I connected with Officer Miller, a corrections officer who insisted on payment in cryptocurrency. He warned that harvesting what I needed wouldn't be easy. Then there was Travis, a funeral home worker just starting to dabble in the occult. He barely charged me anything, just wanted me to spread the word about his services. But the most unexpected seller was Nancy, a suburban mom who handcrafted ritual tools in her basement, no questions asked. Just when I had everything arranged, Karen called. She was furious, saying I was stressing Danny out. I told her I was in the middle of trying to save his life. She hung up on me. It didn't matter. I wasn't stopping now. I went through my checklist one last time, paid my rent ahead to ensure no one disturbed me, and locked the door behind me. Before I could start the ritual, I had to take a few more steps. The book instructed me to seal off my Brooklyn studio and undergo purification. I tore open the first bag of salt and began lining every doorway, window, and corner of the space. By the time I was finished, I had gone through 10 full bags. I made sure to go over the barriers twice to ensure there were no gaps. This was the only way to keep unwanted spirits from interfering. With that done, it was time to prepare myself. The book required me to be pure in body and mind for the ritual to work. The first part was simple. No food. Just water. Complete fasting during the purification phase. But clearing my mind was the tricky part. Every night at midnight, I had to sit facing east, light a candle, and focus on my ultimate goal, the reason I was doing all of this. The Codex of Decay stated that this phase had to last 3 days. The first was brutal. My stomach ached from hunger, and by evening, my hands trembled so badly I could barely hold the match to light the candle. I forced myself to sit there, staring into the flickering flame, picturing Danny healed. I envisioned us grabbing drinks together, laughing at his ridiculous jokes. I saw him at the U.S. Attorney's office, reviewing case files. And finally, I imagined standing beside him at his wedding as his best man. The hunger faded. Time blurred. When I came back to reality, the candle had burned out, and daylight was creeping in through the windows. By the 3rd night, I was almost eager to continue. The visions of Danny felt so tangible that I welcomed the hunger. I hadn't felt this focused in years. That final night, when I lit the candle, something inside me shifted, like a piece locking into place. I was ready to begin. The following night, I cleared my living room, then burned a blend of herbs, making sure the smoke filled every inch of my studio. It didn't take long before the banging started. The old woman from across the hall pounded on my door, furious about the smell. I ignored her. I had to keep going. Last I heard, she was threatening to call the fire department. It didn't matter. There were 6 steps to this ritual, and each one had to be completed at midnight. The book also made one thing clear: I couldn't proceed to the next step until I received the sign. Step 1. Light candles made from the fat of a condemned man, then recite the first incantation. I pulled out the candles I had sourced from the occult market. 1 in each cardinal direction: north, south, east, and west. As soon as the clock struck midnight, I moved around the space, lighting each one. Then, standing at the center, I opened the Codex of Decay. The words of the incantation were in a language I didn't recognize. I tried plugging the words into Google, but nothing came up. That meant I had no way of knowing if I was pronouncing them correctly. I did my best to enunciate each syllable as clearly as possible, hoping it would be enough. The instant I finished reading, a loud pounding erupted at my door. Just what I needed, the fire department breaking in at the worst possible moment. But then the knocking moved. The next thud came from inside the walls. It traveled along the plaster, shifting from one side of the room to the next. When it reached the window, something rapped lightly against the glass. I lived on the 3rd floor. The curtains concealed whatever was making the noise. The tapping and knocking continued, cycling through the apartment in a steady, unnatural rhythm. It didn't stop until the first rays of sunlight crept through the window. As soon as the noise ceased, I packed up the candles and collapsed into bed. I was drained but optimistic. This had to be the sign the book had described. I was ready for the next phase. I woke up a few hours later. At this stage of the ritual, I was finally allowed to eat again. But the thought of what I had to do next made me lose my appetite. Step 2. Consume a mixture of fresh blood and the ashes of the innocent. The book provided exact measurements for the concoction. I didn't need much, just a mouthful. Still, the very idea of it made my stomach churn. I spent the entire day trying to keep my mind off it, even as I set up the necessary materials. Shot glass, knife, antiseptic. And, of course, the ashes. Midnight arrived. I took a deep breath, watching the blood trickle into the shot glass, swirling as it mixed with the ashes. For the first time, I hesitated. What the hell had I gotten myself into? If it weren't for the knocking the night before, I might have abandoned the ritual right then and there. For all I knew, the Codex of Decay was nothing more than the ramblings of some deranged lunatic. But something had happened. I couldn't deny that. I inhaled deeply, steadied my resolve, and knocked the shot back. The taste was vile. My stomach twisted in protest. I gagged and fought the instinct to vomit. I couldn't let this come back up. I had to keep it down. I had no choice. And then, nothing. I sat on the floor, waiting, watching the clock inch toward dawn. No knocking. No eerie sensations. Not even a sudden chill in the air. Damn it. Had I gone through all of this for nothing? Had I wasted an entire day when Danny didn't have time to lose? No more screw-ups. No more hesitation. The next night, I went through the entire process again. I didn't stop to question it. I sliced my palm open and swallowed the shot in one quick gulp. A few moments later, a terrible sensation ripped through my stomach. I doubled over, unable to hold it back. I vomited violently, but what came out wasn't normal. Thick, black, tar-like sludge spilled from my mouth in dense, writhing ropes. And then, it moved on its own. The liquid slithered across the floor, stretching and spreading until it covered every inch of space. It stopped just before reaching the salt barriers. The mass shuddered, pulsating for a brief moment, then started seeping between the floorboards as though it had never existed. Not even a stain remained. Then, the knocking returned. This time, it came from all directions. Dozens of hands pounded against the walls, overlapping in a deafening cacophony. It felt like an unseen audience was urging me forward. The sound continued all night long. When it finally stopped, I dragged myself to bed. By the time I woke up, it was late afternoon. I felt like I had been hit by a truck. Every muscle in my body ached. My skull throbbed like I'd gone on a whiskey bender. It was the worst hangover I'd ever had. I forced myself to get up and make some mac and cheese. It wasn't much, but it was the only thing I could stomach. Eating felt strangely reassuring, probably the most normal thing I'd done in days. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the landline rang. The sharp sound cut through the silence, making me jump. Then I wondered who the hell could be calling me. I knew better than to pick up. I had come too far to risk sabotaging the ritual now. So, I walked over and unplugged the phone. A minute later, my cell phone buzzed to life. The screen lit up with Danny's name, and my stomach twisted. My inbox was overflowing with missed calls and unread messages. Most of them were from Danny. It tore me up to ignore them. I wasn't even sure if reading his texts would break the rules, but I couldn't take the chance. The phone kept ringing. "I'm sorry, Danny. But this is all for you." I swallowed my guilt and declined the call. Then I shut the phone off completely. I needed to focus on the next step. Step 3. Build an effigy using the personal belongings of the sick and encircle it with salt. Compared to the previous step, this one seemed almost easy. I assembled the old mannequin I had bought specifically for this. Then I pulled out Danny's clothes and his framed graduation photo. As midnight drew closer, I tried to steady my nerves by meditating. I had developed a habit of meditating whenever I needed to clear my head or pass time. It helped remind me why I was doing all of this, that it would all be worth it. I was almost at peace when the disconnected landline rang. It buzzed 3 times before cutting off mid-ring. The moment the clock struck midnight, I began. I dressed the mannequin in Danny's hoodie and the shirt he had worn the last time we went out together. Then I taped his photo onto its face. Around the mannequin, I poured a thick, unbroken ring of salt. Then I stepped back and waited. The room was silent. The hours dragged on. When the first light of dawn crept through the windows, I clenched my fists. Another wasted night. Danny didn't have time for mistakes. Frustrated, I dismantled the entire setup and went to bed. When I woke up, I was still seething. What did I miss? Maybe I needed to purify myself again. It was worth a shot. I had barely been eating anyway. I spent the entire day fixated on the candle flame, thinking about Danny. I couldn't afford another failure. The ritual had to go perfectly from now on. That night, I recreated the setup meticulously. I reassembled the mannequin, smoothed out the clothes, and made sure the salt circle was as flawless as possible. Then, I waited. Again. And yet, nothing happened. I stayed awake until morning. Then, furious, I ripped the mannequin apart. I tore the clothes off with more force than necessary. What was I missing? What else could I possibly do? I was starving, exhausted. My ribs pressed sharply against my skin. I could barely stand. I stumbled to the kitchen, desperate for food. But when I opened the fridge, I recoiled. The stench hit me like a punch to the gut. Everything inside had rotted. Vegetables had liquefied into a foul sludge. The meat had turned an unnatural shade of green. Maggots squirmed over spoiled food. The milk container had burst, leaving a curdled, putrid mess at the bottom. I had restocked just a few days ago, and the fridge was still running. I checked the cupboards, same thing. The cans were rusted. The mac and cheese was covered in fuzzy mold. Even the peanut butter had transformed into a sickly green paste. And then it hit me. This was the sign I'd been waiting for. I could proceed. This meant I wouldn't have anything to eat until the ritual was over. But I was past the halfway mark now. Only 3 steps left. I can survive that long. For Danny. Step 4. Burn the effigy while chanting the second incantation. I forced myself back to the living room to prepare. The mannequin stood at the center of the space. The same one I had just torn apart. Now dressed in Danny's clothes again, its base surrounded by a pristine circle of salt. Everything was set. All that was left was to wait for midnight. I collapsed into bed, utterly drained but strangely relieved. The end was close. Danny would be healed in just a few more days. I drifted into a deep sleep, the best rest I'd had in weeks. When I woke, it was nearly midnight. My body felt even weaker than before. It was a struggle just to get to the living room. And yet, despite it all, I felt exhilarated. With trembling hands, I struck a match and set the mannequin ablaze. The fire caught immediately, devouring the fabric in seconds. The flames consumed it, growing stronger with each passing moment. The acrid scent of melting plastic filled the air. I began reciting the second incantation, my hands barely steady enough to hold the book upright. I focused on pronouncing each syllable correctly. As I chanted, Danny's photograph began to shift. The image turned its head ever so slightly and grinned at me. Then, his face seemed to move closer, as if the Danny in the picture was stepping toward me. His features filled the frame. The flames licked at the edges of the photo, causing them to curl and darken. As the fire distorted the image, Danny's smile twisted into an expression of sheer terror. The moment I uttered the last word of the chant, the landline blared to life. Its shrill rings echoed through the studio, each one drilling into my skull. Over and over again. It only stopped when the fire finally died out. When it was over, the mannequin was reduced to a melted heap of plastic. The clothes had been completely incinerated. Danny's photo was now nothing more than a crumpled, charred scrap. Too exhausted to deal with the mess, I stumbled toward the bedroom and collapsed onto the mattress. The moment my head hit the pillow, the entire bed frame cracked apart beneath me. I jolted upright. My studio was crumbling. The paint was peeling in strips from the walls. Deep fractures ran across the ceiling. The windows were coated in grime so thick, barely any light could pass through. Somewhere, a light bulb shattered. I shuffled to the bathroom sink, turning the faucet. The water barely trickled out before stopping altogether. I cupped what little I could in my hands and sipped. Then, I caught my reflection in the cracked mirror. My face was riddled with tiny, fresh cuts. I had no idea how they got there. I wiped at the blood with the hem of my tattered shirt, full of holes I didn't remember tearing. I didn't have time to dwell on it. I needed rest. I collapsed onto the couch, stirring up a thick layer of dust. The springs jabbed into my back. I closed my eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. Instead, I lay there, lost in my thoughts of Danny. I missed him more than ever. But I just needed to hold on a little longer. 2 more steps. I clung to that thought as I waited for midnight. Throughout the day, I heard my surroundings deteriorate further. Furniture buckled under their own weight. Glass shattered at random. Another bulb burst. By evening, every appliance had completely stopped functioning. I remained on the couch, unwilling to waste the little energy I had left. I needed to save my strength. Step 5. Stare into a mirror in absolute darkness. I started by clearing away what remained of the charred mannequin from the night before. Then, I hauled the bathroom mirror into the living room and propped it against the wall. Now, all that was left to do was wait for midnight. I wished I could meditate like before, to distract myself, to push past the gnawing hunger. But the candles were all gone. So, I just lay there. Every movement set pain shooting through my limbs. By the time midnight arrived, the entire studio was swallowed by darkness. Usually, the streetlights outside would offer some faint illumination, but that night, there was nothing. Had the whole block lost power? I didn't have the strength to check. The air was thick, suffocating. Every breath felt like a struggle. I sat up, facing the mirror. I couldn't even tell if my eyes were open or closed. I simply stayed still, hoping to make it through the night. The next thing I knew, sunlight was spilling across my face. I was sprawled out on the living room floor, my entire body stiff and aching. Had I passed out? I turned my gaze toward the mirror, expecting nothing. Instead, I saw my own reflection staring back at me. But I wasn't alone. Behind me stood the mannequin, whole once again. Even its clothes looked untouched. But its face, it had changed. Now, it looked just like Danny. That was it. That was the line I wouldn't let this ritual cross. Whatever this thing was, it couldn't wear Danny's face. I seized the mannequin and shoved it into the closet. The moment I slammed the closet door shut, a faint knocking echoed from within. I froze in place. The knocking grew louder, more insistent. For the first time, doubt crawled into my mind. Had I invited something into my home that I couldn't control? My eyes darted to the nearest window. The knocking didn't stop. I needed something normal, something real. I turned toward the street below. The city was eerily still. It was the middle of the day, yet the sidewalks were deserted. No cars, no pedestrians, just silence. The sun beamed down from a cloudless sky, but something about it seemed unnatural, like an artificial backdrop. As I scanned the area, my gaze landed on movement across the street. A figure drifted past a window. It was a man. Or at least, I thought it was. His limbs moved unnaturally, as though his joints had been assembled incorrectly. And he was towering, far too tall. His head nearly brushed the top of the window frame. 2 massive goat horns curled from his skull. My stomach lurched. I didn't want him to see me. I stumbled back, heart hammering in my chest. My foot caught on something, and I crashed into an object behind me. I spun around, Danny's face stared back at me. The mannequin's grin stretched unnaturally wide, its hands reaching toward me. I reacted without thinking. I swung hard, knocking the head clean off its shoulders. It struck the wall with a dull crack before rolling across the floor. Blood began seeping from the severed head, pooling around it. My hands shook as I fumbled through the Codex of Decay. None of this made sense. This was supposed to be a healing ritual. My stomach twisted with hunger, exhaustion, and fear. I flipped through the pages, my vision blurring. I had followed every step exactly. But as I reached the final page, a sinking feeling settled in my gut. Only one step remained. Step 6, sacrifice your happiest memory. This section was nearly illegible, scrawled in erratic handwriting. The ink smeared in places, as if the author had been in a hurry or frantic. I read the passage over and over, trying to make sense of it. That's when I saw it, a final note hastily scratched at the bottom of the page. A warning. It stated that a banishing ritual had to be performed immediately after the wish was granted. Without it, the act of fulfilling the wish would unleash something into the world. But whatever that something was, its name had been violently crossed out with thick black ink. Panic gripped me as I flipped to the next page. The banishing spell should have been there. But the page had been torn out. A heavy thudding sound reverberated through the studio. The light outside dimmed, not because of the setting sun. No, it was as if someone was shutting the sky off. The once blue expanse turned a flat, lifeless gray, stretching outward like an impenetrable wall. Then it began to crack. Jagged fractures spread, splitting reality apart at the seams. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught movement. The mannequin. It stood upright again, its head somehow reattached. But it wasn't smiling anymore. Instead, it looked sorrowful. Disappointed. Like Danny had the last time I saw him in the hospital. He had only wanted me to stay. To be there when he needed me. Just as he had always been there for me. He wouldn't have wanted this. He wouldn't have wanted me to bring something like this into the world. I had made a lot of mistakes in my life. And I was about to make the worst one yet. With a surge of desperation, I tossed the book aside and yanked my phone from my pocket. Please, let it not be too late. Everything else in the studio had stopped working, but miraculously, my phone powered on. The screen blinked to life, fully charged. My notifications flooded in at once. Missed calls. Dozens of messages from Danny. He had been trying to reach me. First worried, then panicked. He said he had been having dreams about me, visions of me trapped, my home engulfed in flames. He just wanted to know if I was okay. God, I was an idiot. My hand shook as I tapped his name and dialed. Danny picked up on the third ring. Hey Danny, can I come by today? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. That was all it took. As we spoke, sunlight streamed back into the room. Outside, I could hear the normal sounds of the city again, cars honking, people talking, life moving on. It was over. I told Danny I'd be there soon, bringing him some new books. He said he'd stay up and wait for me. Before I left, I picked up the Codex of Decay one last time and turned to the final page. Then, I added one last step. Step 7, don't perform the ritual. Friends, if you like the story, Please write your impressions in the comments and be sure to subscribe to the channel.